Hi viewers. So in this video, let's try to understand what web services are. A web service is by definition any service that's available to communicate with another service or an application over the network. So this is a very generic definition, right? So now you may have a logic of some sort of a program available for another program to utilize over the network, then the former can be called a service. So when you mean or call it a web service, usually formally this was referred to a service that was available over the network, and that's over the internet basically. So that's where this term web came in. But nowadays, the term services is more common because it has evolved to a level that a service can be exposed in any network. It doesn't have to be over the internet. However, exposing over the internet is usually commonplace. And also, the term web service was more implied to mean those days. I'm talking about a few decades ago, like 2 decades ago, to refer to such technologies as XML RPC, JSON RPC, and subsequently for SOAP web services and so forth. But as I mentioned, the term web services evolved, and there came more service types in the industry where other terminology and vocabulary became more popular, and this term web services kind of meant to mean a common thing, not specifically SOAP, not specifically XML RPC, not specifically a particular type of technology, but anything that exposes over the internet or the web can be called as a web service. However, if you talk to some folk, web services for them could mean SOAP and XML based technologies, which is fine. So, as I mentioned, after SOAP services, other technologies became popular, particularly the REST APIs and so forth, REST services, representational state transfer. And in the modern world, you see other types of services prevalent as well, such as gRPC and GraphQL and so forth, right? So basically, GraphQL is something that's developed on top of REST in a way, conceptually, and so forth. And then also, came the era of various different architectures. Now, you would have heard of these. Uh, buzzwords like SOA, MSA, and service mesh architecture and so forth. SOA stands for service oriented architecture, and decades ago it meant that everything being done in some sort of a service, such as web services and SOAP services for everything to communicate in between various different processes for inter-process communication and so forth. And that became later to, it also led the you know paved the way for this other technology or the other architecture called MSA, microservices architecture. It didn't mean anything different, but the microservices were more focused on one particular job and so forth. And with the explosion of these microservices and services in an architecture, it's easy that you find exploding endpoint problem, which paved the way for service mesh architectures and so forth. Let's move on and try to understand actors in a web services architecture. Now, I'm kind of uh, you know before we go there, so let's also understand the traits of web services. So, as I mentioned, it's usually when we talk about web services, it means a service that is available over the internet or intranet, as I mentioned. Now, usually, those days it meant those services that are available over the internet. However, if you look at the current terminology and current way of thinking, it could be anything even available over the intranet. And usually these services uses standard messaging, right? Such as XML, JSON, text, and SOAP, and so forth, right? Now, if you look at these terminologies like XML, JSON, these are messaging formats. These are not transport level protocols. These are like application level protocols. So these services usually use such messaging, right? And the one good thing about web services is that there were other technologies in the past to accomplish inter-process communication, but most were tied to a particular programming language. Your server is written in a particular programming language, and the clients have to be written in the same programming language to communicate. But in the world of web services, that was eliminated, which was a great accomplishment because that kinds of opens up a lot of possibilities for interoperation. And web services can be implemented in any programming language that you can think of, and clients can also be implemented in another programming language. It doesn't have to be the same programming language as the server. And usually in web services world, there is some way of discovering your services. Now, when you have like thousands and thousands of services, how do you know which services are available? In the soap world, we'll talk about that a bit later. There were other technologies that was more focused on discovery alone, but discovery as a concept is very similar. It's basically knowing about a particular service, and how do we make know others that such a service is available, and so forth, right? That's the concept. So the other thing about the web services, usually those are self-contained and self-described, meaning once you have a web service, there must be a way of packaging that and also describing it. So usually for various types of services, the way that it accomplishes this is different. However, the concept of self-describing means there is a way of uh, a service describing itself is more prevalent. And it promotes modularity, of course, because you can focus on one work at a time, right? So in a web services architecture, now in this particular video, I'll be more focused on SOAP, even though it's a kind of an older technology now, a legacy technology. However, it's still being used in various different contexts. So let's talk in SOAP's context so that you get the understanding from the technologies that drove the services concept to the current stage, so that way you will have a better understanding. So and this is kind of applicable even for other services, but there are minor differences. So in actors wise, in a web services architecture, there is always a service provider. A service provider is someone who provides that service, right? Usually, let's say an enterprise exposing a web service for another consumer to consume, then that enterprise is the service provider, right? And then there is also a service consumer or the requester, whoever is using that web service. So typically, a developer developing an application, then that application is the consumer, or a web app can be a consumer, or even sometimes a script can be a consumer. Doesn't matter. Whoever is consuming can be considered a service consumer or requester. And in the SOAP world, basically there is also this concept of service registry. This is one way of letting others know about services, or you can call it as a service broker as well. And it's simply nothing more than a directory or a repository of the web service details. Let's move on. So if you talk about the web services protocol stack, again, as I mentioned, I'm more focused on the older type of web services because that's what usually the web services meant. However, as I mentioned initially, it's now a common word, so it can refer to other service types as well, right? Like REST, gRPC, and so forth. But for your understanding, let's talk through that older messaging protocol like SOAP over HTTP, right? SOAP over any other protocol. So in a web services protocol stack, you have various layers. Now at the bottom, you see a transport layer. In the transport layer, you have various different protocols. We call those transport layer protocols. So this is how one entity or one service talks to another service over the wire. And these protocols basically explain, at the bottom layer, how things work. These are not like wire level protocols, but still these are like application level protocols, right? Transport protocols are still application layer protocols because applications need to understand about HTTP, TCP, SMTP, FTP, and so forth. And there are hardware level protocols. Like usually we don't call it a protocol in that way, but terminology can be used that applications don't need to understand, and it will not have any knowledge about how things work at the bottom layer, like TCP, IP protocol, and so forth, right? And so now HTTP is one of the most popular transport level protocols, right? And at the bottom layer, how things work. Transport layer, in the sense, you can just think it as a transport, but it's application level protocol as well. And transmission control protocol is even more lower layer than HTTP. HTTP is built on top of TCP previously, but of course HTTP 2 now has moved away from TCP. All that is different. So that's one good indication that HTTP doesn't have to be relied on TCP. And but HTTP version 1 and version 1.1 were dependent on TCP. And SMTP is a simple mail transfer protocol, and FTP is file transfer protocol. But now, when you talk about HTTP, it doesn't say how the application level messaging should be communicated. Like, how does the application understand various data transferred? That can be raw XML, which is something that you can come up with, or a raw JSON, or in XML. In the XML RPC world, you can consider these as XML RPC. There is a particular uh, understanding between the client and the server. And SOAP became much more popular because of its ability to describe itself and various other definitions that became on how to uh, describe types and operations of various things that needs to be understood between client and the server. And then I also talked about self-describing. In the world of SOAP, particularly, this web services description language became very popular, WSDL. And so WSDL is a way of telling to clients, okay, these are my operations, these are my types, this is how you need to communicate with me, and so forth. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And in the same uh, family of specifications, there also became other specifications such as WS policy. WS policy just is a way of telling, okay, when you communicate with that service, you need to adhere to certain security policies, certain other ways of uh, interacting, and so forth. So it's a very that's what actually made this particular framework a bloated specification, because it just came up with quite a lot of specs, which was hard to implement by real implementation, uh, whoever wanted to do that. And so then also quality of service measures, like you often come across this terminology WS hyphen asterisk, which stands for WS specs, like policy, security, addressing, and remoting, RM, and so forth. So each addresses a specific domain in the web services world, like security, addressing, and so forth. And yeah, so that's what quality of services uh, do, and so forth. But those technologies that I have come across in web services world, not every web services technology framework actually supports all of these measures like quality of service and other stuff. And even discovery. Discovery in the world of soap was accomplished using UDDI, that's Universal Discovery Interface and so forth, right? So we'll talk about that also a little bit later. But these actually, as I mentioned, because there were not many implementers of these technologies, this technology actually faded away. And on top of that, there were other technologies built using the web services layer, such as for business processes. People came up with notations for business process, uh, and those notations were called BPEL, usually called BPEL and BPMN and so forth. And these are usually meant to describe long running processes that involve humans to interact, such as giving approval for certain processes and so forth at a particular stage before moving on to the next level. So let's talk about XML RPC as I mentioned. So XML RPC is simply an XML over HTTP. So it uses HTTP as the transport layer and the messaging layer is XML. And this is the pre-SOAP era where web services began sort of with XML RPC, and it had a very minimal data type uh, set of data types, and such as like integer, double, and so forth. How you transfer and tell your server and the client, okay, what I'm sending over XML, this particular tag is a string, this particular tag is a date, this particular tag is a integer, and so forth. So that's what a data type stands for. So XML RPC was very simple, not extensive enough for complex scenarios, and that was the drawback of XML RPC. So that's what led to the development of its successor, which is SOAP. So SOAP protocol is again a messaging protocol. And if you look at today, you might come across two versions of that, SOAP 1.1 and 1.2, and there are only minor differences between those two. So initially, that acronym SOAP stood for Simple Object Access Protocol, but today it doesn't stand for anything, right? So because its idea went beyond accessing objects. So actually, there is nothing like the very older technology called COBA, and SOAP doesn't do anything like that. But it's just describing the way to pass data over HTTP or any other transport protocol, right? And SOAP didn't depend on HTTP. It could be sent over TCP, it could be sent over UDP, and so forth. But however, what many implementers did was they made SOAP services and SOAP clients communicate over HTTP. So it led to the belief that SOAP was married to HTTP, and even though it didn't have to, but it looked like so. And it was comprehensive and elaborative than XML RPC because it had its own type system and so forth. Initially it had its own type system, and then it kind of adopted the XSD schema type system. And initially the SOAP started developing its own type system because when SOAP was developed, XSD schema was being developed in parallel, or it was probably came after that. But when it became a thing and more robust in terms of describing data types of various things for XML based technology, SOAP kind of adopted that. So that's the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And uh, and as I mentioned, it could be used on any other transport protocol. It doesn't have to be through HTTP, but uh, you know many implementers did it on top of HTTP, and even the SOAP specification had details about how to implement things on top of HTTP rather than with other things. So it kind of became more of a reference transport, and because of that, it led to a belief that it's mostly SOAP is for SOAP, but it is not, right? And SOAP specification, you can go look at this in the w3.org website. You can look through the SOAP specification. and it was prepared by the XML protocol working group. So to give you a very broad and 30,000 foot view of this particular specification, it contains of four sections. One is what they call a SOAP primer, where they introduce the SOAP messaging and terminology and other fundamentals, and then they come into the other section called SOAP message formats and explain the details like the SOAP envelope and other details such as the header blocks and so forth. So the specifications usually comprise of these things that explain how uh, things work in that particular protocol, and it cannot assume anything. It basically describes everything. So usually specifications are lengthy documents. And then again, in the third section, it talks about data models and other encodings, how things can be encoded and so forth. And then it just goes on talking about assertions and test collections. So if you ask me what are these, it's very hard to describe in a video like this, but however, what I wanted to kind of give you is this is what it is, and now you can go deep dive in the real world if you want to understand about it or implement a SOAP service and so forth. Okay, so then SOAP's HTTP usage, and if you look at SOAP services available today, you might possibly come across SOAP services communicating over HTTP mostly. But as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be uh, only HTTP. So it doesn't have to be only HTTP, and but you will see mostly SOAP over HTTP post, but GET method can also be used. But why post was used? Because GET has other limitations when it comes to length and so forth. Okay, moving on. And now we'll let's talk about the web services description language. So it is a specification for describing web services, of course, because it's what it stands for. So web services description language. And in essence, it's a contract between the client and the service. A service can tell, okay, this is what my service looks like. You can read through this and then try to understand what you can do with me. So that's what basically web services description language do. And basically any type of specification or description language has the same concept, right? And that's why I mentioned like it's much like the purpose of today's open API specification for REST APIs. And in the olden days for programming language APIs, and even today, right, I cannot say it's or olden days, but for your programming language APIs, you usually have an API documentation telling, okay, this is how the API should be called, and these are the data types, these are my parameters, and so forth. The same concept in the web services world, but it's described as a document. So it's a specification by itself, right? And WSDL, or we can why I'm calling it WSDL, because it's also that particular word is being used by many to refer to WSDL. So you might come across people telling WSDL, right? So I'll use that word as well. So let's be comfortable with that word as well. So it has below four formats. So it just has four different, like the specification. It also has four different sections or parts. So it has one section called interface information on available functions. It will tell about different operations. Okay, these are the operations that we have. And then it talks about the data types of message, requests, and responses. Okay, your message request for this operation should look like this in XML. And if a successful call of this particular request will have a response like this, that detail will also be there. And it's not an example, but this all are described in the XSD schema format. And schema format is very complex and very versatile. So it can describe a wide variety of XML formats and so forth. And it will also talk about binding information on the transport protocol. So usually it has only been HTTP. That's what I mentioned. Like not any other technology were used with SOAP. So HTTP was the only thing. So in the WSDL language itself, you could see in most of the time how things have to be bound with that service. And it will also have the endpoint details of where this particular service is hosted. And what does this particular WSDL do and similar specifications? It allows clients to automatically detect how to interact with the service. It doesn't need to know anything else. By reading this file, a client should be able to automatically know how to invoke the backend service. Okay, so the next thing is the WSDL specification. So we talked about WSDL, but there is like as the SOAP specification, WSDL also has a specification. It is an XML grammar, and now SOAP had 4 sections and WSDL has 6 sections. And right, so those 6 sections include, first, it talks about the types. So basically, it uses the XML schema types, and if only that is used, it's optional. And then it goes on talk about the message and describes a single message, a request and response, and how that can be done and so forth. And then there is a section called port type specification and defines operations. Now in WSDL, I mentioned that there are operations, and those operations could use one or more messages. And usually it's one, but there can be situations where more messages are used across an operation. So in the WSDL specification, that's called a port type. It's not called an operation, simply an operation. It could have been a better word to use, but they called it. I don't know why. Who thought that a port type is a better word to be used there? And then again, binding is things like the transport. Again, these words look very complex, but conceptually, it's very simple on what they're trying to say. And then serve is the endpoint of the service. And there can be 2 other utility elements, specifically talking about the documentation, the human readable documentation, and whether it can be an HTML document or a very small text describing all that. And also import statements to other WSDLs. A WSDL can depend on another WSDL or other XML document. So simply, so in this video, what I spoke about was mainly what is a web service, and then we just did a little zoom in to the SOAP world, and then we described about SOAP and the web service protocol stack, and understood various different things, and then also described about its description and so forth. So I'll stop at this moment, and we'll have more details coming up about other service discovery and quality of service measures in another video. But why I want to stop is because those sections, as in web services world, is rarely used, and most implementations that's available actually don't support all of those as well. So even if you really want to use that thing, you will come across challenges on real um, concrete implementation that's available. So that's something that you should learn if you are trying to implement something on that. But in SOAP, technology has become already kind of grandfathered now. So it's highly unlikely that you might want to implement a SOAP services and web services implementation stack by yourself. But if you do want to, you can go refer to all these specifications in the w3.org. I'll see you in another video very soon. Thanks for watching.